You think you know someone. I thought I knew Dahlia, the woman I married, the one I swore to build a life with. For the first few months, everything felt like a dream. Breakfast in bed, late-night movies, spontaneous road trips. We talked about kids, our dream home, vacations we'd take. But somewhere along the way, cracks started to appear, and I didn't want to see them at first. I mean, who wants to believe that their perfect life is just a fantasy waiting to fall apart? It started with the little things. At first, I thought I was overreacting. You know how it goes. Marriage is new, and adjustments are part of the deal, right? But the little things add up. They always do. One evening, I noticed Dahlia sitting on the couch, texting. That wasn't unusual. She's always been glued to her phone. But this time, the way she moved felt off. The second I walked into the room, she tucked her phone under her leg like she was hiding it. "What's up?" I asked casually, trying not to sound suspicious. She looked up with that fake, practiced smile of hers, the one I hadn't seen before we got married. "It's just Sherry," she said, waving her phone around like it didn't matter. "Work stuff." I nodded, playing along, but something didn't sit right with me. Her gaze was too deliberate, her posture too guarded. And then, as if on cue, she got up and walked into the other room. That was the first time it hit me, the first little knot of unease in my stomach. But I brushed it off. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I was just tired. Still, the feeling stuck with me. A couple of weeks later, we went to a party at one of our mutual friends' houses. I was trying to be the laid-back husband, chatting with friends, enjoying the night. Dahlia looked stunning, as always. But something was different. The way she carried herself, the way her eyes flicked across the room, scanning it like she was looking for someone. I noticed it, but I told myself I was imagining things. And then I saw him, Liam Green. He wasn't a friend of mine, more of a casual acquaintance. Tall, well-dressed, and way too confident for my liking. The way he smiled at Dahlia set my teeth on edge. But it wasn't just him. It was the way she looked at him. There was a spark in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. Not since the early days of our marriage. And then it happened. Liam's hand brushed against hers. A quick touch, subtle enough that no one else would notice. But I noticed. And the worst part? She didn't pull away. She smiled instead. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. What the hell was going on? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching something unfold right in front of me. It was like standing in the middle of a burning house and being the only one who realized the walls were on fire. After the party, I confronted her. Not directly, but enough to feel her out. "So Liam, huh?" I said casually as we drove home. She rolled her eyes and laughed, but it felt forced. "What? Don't be ridiculous. He's just a friend." "Just a friend. Isn't that always the line?" When we got home that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the scene at the party. Her laugh, the way Liam's hand touched hers, and that look in her eyes. I needed to talk to someone, so I called my friend Adam Rivers the next day. Adam has always been the logical one, the voice of reason. "You're overthinking it, man," Adam said when I told him everything. "Everyone flirts a little. It's harmless. You gotta give her some space. People are stressed these days, especially with work and life piling up." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him so badly. I wanted to think that I was just being paranoid and that Dahlia and I were still the same couple we'd always been. But deep down, I knew something was off. "You think so?" I asked, trying to sound convinced. "Adam Sikit. Look, Jasper, you love her. You guys are still figuring things out. Don't go looking for problems where there aren't any. Just talk to her. Give her some time." So that's what I did. I gave her space. I gave her time. And in return, I got a wife who drifted further and further away from me every day. In the weeks that followed, things didn't get better. Dahlia became colder, more distant. Conversations that used to flow naturally became awkward and forced. She stopped laughing at my jokes. She stopped cuddling with me on the couch during our movie marathons. Hell, she even started sleeping on the far edge of the bed, as if the few extra inches of space between us were enough to keep me from noticing the emotional canyon growing between us. Every time I tried to bring it up, she shut me down. "You're overreacting," she'd say, her voice sharp with annoyance. "Not everything is about you, Jasper." And maybe she was right. Maybe it wasn't about me. but it sure as hell felt like it. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. She was on her phone again, typing away with that stupid smile on her face. And I snapped. "Who the hell are you texting at 11 at night, Dahlia?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. She looked up, her expression shifting from amusement to irritation in an instant. "Jesus, Jasper. It's Sherry. We've been over this." "Then show me." Her eyes narrowed, and for a second, I saw something flash across her face. Guilt, maybe, or fear. But it was gone just as quickly. "You don't trust me," she whispered, her voice low and dangerous. "No, I don't. Not when you're acting like this." She stood up, her eyes burning with anger. "You know what your problem is? You always think the worst of me. You can't stand the idea that maybe I'm not sitting here plotting against you. Maybe I just want some goddamn space." The argument spiraled from there, dragging up old wounds and new insecurities. By the time it was over, we were both exhausted and furious. She stormed off to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. And I sat on the couch, my head in my hands, wondering how the hell we'd ended up like this. That night, as I lay awake on the couch, I realized something. This wasn't just a rough patch. This wasn't just the stress of married life. Something was seriously wrong between us. And no matter how much I wanted to deny it, the truth was staring me in the face. Dahlia was slipping away from me, one day at a time. And the worst part? I had no idea how to stop it. After the fight with Dahlia, I tried convincing myself that I was being paranoid. I told myself that it was all in my head, that marriages go through phases, that this was just one of those rough patches everyone talks about. But that gnawing feeling in my gut never left. It was there when I woke up, when I went to work, and when I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, knowing she was only a few feet away, but feeling like she was a stranger. I kept trying to act normal around her, hoping things would smooth out if I just played it cool. But it was impossible to ignore the way she avoided me, the way her phone was always face down, the way she'd leave the room when I walked in. I started shutting down emotionally. Talking felt pointless because it always ended the same way. Her accusing me of being controlling, me feeling like I was losing my mind. I stopped trying to argue and just withdrew. It was easier that way. But inside, the sense of betrayal festered. I kept telling myself to trust her, but every time I saw that look on her face, the one I'd caught at the party when Liam's hand touched hers, it was like a knife twisting deeper into my gut. I couldn't shake the image of it. Then one night, out of the blue, Bree showed up at my door. I hadn't seen her in a few months, and it felt strange to see her standing there, holding a bottle of wine, grinning like she knew exactly when to appear. Bree's always been good at that, timing things just right. She gave me that knowing smile, the one that made you feel like she could see right through you. "Figured you might need someone to talk to," she said, holding the bottle up. I didn't argue. I stepped aside and let her in. We ended up in the kitchen, sitting across from each other at the small table where Dahlia and I used to have breakfast. Bree poured 2 glasses of wine, leaned forward, and studied me with those sharp eyes of hers. "Something's wrong," she said, not even asking. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "It's Dahlia. Things between us, they've been weird. She's distant. I don't know how to explain it." Bree nodded like she'd been expecting that. "You feel like she's pulling away." "Yeah," I said, my voice low. "And I don't know why. I keep trying to make it work, but it's like she's somewhere else. Like she's not here with me anymore." She reached across the table, placing a warm hand on my shoulder. "I know how hard that can be. It's easy to drive yourself crazy, wondering if you're imagining things. But you need to be sure before you make any big moves. You can't accuse someone of something like that unless you have the facts." I looked down at my glass, swirling the wine around. "I don't know, Bree. I'm not even sure what I'd be accusing her of." She tilted her head slightly, studying me. "Let me help you. Women notice things that men miss. If there's something going on, we'll find out." At first, I wanted to say no. It felt wrong, like spying on my own wife would mean admitting I didn't trust her. But the truth was I didn't trust her. Not anymore. And Bree's offer was exactly the lifeline I needed, even if I hated myself for taking it. I agreed, and just like that, Bree and I were partners in uncovering whatever the hell was going on. We started by combing through Dahlia's social media accounts. Bree was relentless, going through every post, every tag photo, every comment. We didn't find much at first, just a few old messages from Liam. Nothing incriminating. But they were enough to set me on edge. She'd been chatting with him even before the wedding, though the conversations were vague and casual. Still, the timing made me uneasy. "See?" Bree said, pointing at one of the messages. "This was 2 weeks before your wedding. She's already planting seeds with him." I try to shrug it off. It doesn't mean anything. People chat with old friends all the time. Bree gave me a look that told me she wasn't buying it. Maybe. Or maybe she's been building something with him for a while, and you just didn't see it. That thought made my stomach churn. I wanted to stop looking, but Bree wasn't done. She convinced me we needed to take things further. "If we want to know the truth," she said, "we have to see it for ourselves." That's how I found myself sitting in a parked car outside Liam's apartment a few nights later, with Bree by my side. I felt like a creep, sitting there with the engine off, watching the building like some stalker. But I couldn't pull myself away. Bree kept me anchored, her presence oddly reassuring. The first couple of nights were uneventful, just a few people coming and going, no sign of Dahlia. I started to think this whole thing was a mistake, that I was losing my mind chasing shadows. But then on the third night it happened. We were parked a block away, sipping coffee to stay awake, when we saw Liam's car pull up. And there she was, Dahlia, sliding out of the passenger seat, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. My chest tightened as I watched her lean in close, saying something to Liam that made him laugh. And then, without hesitation, she followed him inside. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. Bree didn't say anything at first, just placed a hand on my arm, grounding me. I think she knew words wouldn't help right then. I felt like my entire world had just collapsed, and I was sitting there helpless to stop it. I wanted to storm in, to drag Dahlia out, and demand an explanation. But Bree stopped me. "Not yet," she said softly. "You need all the facts first. You can't confront her without proof. She'll twist it, make you the bad guy." She was right, of course, but that didn't make it any easier. Sitting in that car, watching the apartment building's dark windows, I felt the anger and humiliation boil inside me. It was a rage I'd never known before, sharp and bitter, like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Bree squeezed my arm gently. "You'll get your chance," she whispered. "But not like this. You have to be smart about it." I nodded, though every fiber of my being was screaming to go after them. Instead, I sat there, seething, as the night stretched on. I could feel something shifting inside me, something dangerous. This wasn't just about Dahlia anymore. It was about betrayal, about being played for a fool. And I wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. That night, as I drove Bree home, I realized there was no going back. Whatever happened next, the life I thought I had with Dahlia was over. The only thing left to figure out was how far I was willing to go to make sure she paid for it. After that night parked outside Liam's apartment, I was done pretending everything was fine. There was no going back to how things were. I didn't know how to confront Dahlia yet, but I knew it was coming. I was just waiting for the right moment, the right ammunition. Bree had been right about one thing. If I went at Dahlia without proof, she'd twist it and turn it on me. She was good at that. Too good. I was holding on by a thread, barely keeping myself together, and it felt like Bree was the only person I could lean on. After hours of sitting in silence in that car, Bree placed a hand on my shoulder and gave me a sympathetic look. "You can crash at my place tonight if you want," she offered. "No point in driving home like this." I didn't want to go back to my house anyway. Not to the empty bed, not to the reminders of Dahlia. Exhausted and emotionally wrecked, I agreed. Bree lived just a few blocks away, so we drove there in silence. When we got inside, she kicked off her shoes and grabbed a bottle of wine from the kitchen. "Might as well drink, right?" she said with a tired smile. I nodded, following her to the couch. The wine wasn't fancy, but it didn't matter. At that point, anything to numb the knot of anger and humiliation in my chest was welcome. We talked for a while, the kind of conversation that's more about filling the silence than saying anything important. We talked about life, about how marriage isn't what either of us thought it would be. She vented a little about my dad, about how he never really listened to her. I let a few things slip about Dahlia. More than I probably should have, but I didn't care. The wine was working its way into my system, making me loosen up, and the comfort of having someone to talk to made it feel safe. Too safe. Somewhere between the third and fourth glass, the air between us shifted. I felt it before it even happened. This slow, creeping change in the way she looked at me. She leaned in a little closer, her hand brushing against mine. "You've grown up so much these past few years," she murmured, her voice low and warm. It was a simple sentence, but it landed heavy. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized how close we were sitting. Her perfume, the warmth of her skin, everything about her felt overwhelming in that moment. And I didn't move away. I didn't stop it. Our eyes locked, and suddenly, the tension between us felt unbearable. It was like all the emotions I'd been stuffing down, the anger, the betrayal, the sadness, were looking for a way out. And Bree was right there, close and familiar, offering something I hadn't felt in a long time. Comfort, attention, and maybe a little desire. She placed her hand on my knee, a slow, deliberate movement. I knew where this was going. I knew I should have stopped it, but I didn't. I let it happen. Her hand slid higher, and I felt a wave of something I couldn't quite name. Something between fear and desire, guilt and relief. And just like that, the walls between us crumbled. The kiss was sudden, like a spark catching fire. I tasted the wine on her lips, and before I knew it, we were tangled together on the couch, hands everywhere, clothes being pulled off in a blur of heat and desperation. Bree whispered things, soft, seductive things that made me forget, just for a little while, about everything else. She offered to go down on me, and in that hazy, wine-soaked moment, I didn't say no. I let it happen, and then, before I could even think about stopping, we were having sex. It was raw, reckless, and wrong in every way imaginable. But it also felt like a release, like I was finally taking something back after everything Dahlia had stolen from me. For a brief, fleeting moment, I felt free. Free from the lies, from the humiliation, from the weight of my crumbling marriage. But it wasn't that simple. As soon as it was over, the guilt hit me like a freight train. I lay there, breathing hard, staring at the ceiling and wondering what the hell I'd just done. Bree curled up beside me. Running her fingers lightly over my chest like this was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe, to her, it was... I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I'd crossed a line I could never uncross, and there was no undoing it. But what shocked me the most was how little I regretted it. Part of me knew it was wrong, knew I'd betrayed not just Dahlia, but my dad too. But another part of me felt something close to satisfaction, like the scales had finally tipped in my favor, like Dahlia wasn't the only one who got to break the rules. The next morning, Bree acted like nothing had happened. She got up, made coffee, and smiled at me like we'd just had a friendly chat the night before. "You can always count on me," she said as she handed me a cup. There was no awkwardness, no guilt on her end, just an easy, casual acceptance of what we'd done. We didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. It was one of those unspoken agreements, the kind where both people know better than to bring it up. Whatever happened between us that night would stay buried. I left her place feeling numb, like I was moving through someone else's life. As I drove home, the events of the night before played over and over in my mind. The sex, the release, the sense of liberation, and the crushing weight of knowing I just made everything infinitely more complicated. When I walked through the door of my house, Dahlia wasn't home. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty living room, feeling like a stranger in my own life. There was no going back now. Everything had changed. The morning after Bree and I slept together, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just detonated a bomb that hadn't fully gone off yet. Guilt gnawed at me, but it was tangled with something else, something darker and more complicated. I knew what I'd done with Bree wasn't just a mistake. It was an act of revenge, a way of clawing back some of the control that had been slipping from my hands since I first suspected Dahlia of cheating. But now the lines between right and wrong were so blurred, I wasn't sure which betrayal weighed heavier, mine or hers. Either way, I couldn't live with it anymore. I needed to confront her. I needed the truth. I spent the entire day rehearsing what I'd say, but when Dahlia finally came home that evening, All my plans flew out the window. She strolled in like nothing was wrong, setting her purse down and scrolling through her phone as if the world hadn't just shattered beneath my feet. I stood in the living room, watching her, waiting for the right moment. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it. No more pretending. Dahlia, I said, my voice steady but heavy. We need to talk. She looked up, raising a brow. What now, Jasper? I bit down on the inside of my cheek, trying to stay calm. You've been seeing Liam. Her expression barely flickered. What? No, I haven't. Jesus, Jasper, you're imagining things again. I've seen the messages. I pulled my phone from my pocket and showed her the screenshots Bree and I had dug up. Don't lie to me. Her face tightened, a flicker of panic flashing in her eyes before she plastered on that dismissive smile I'd grown to hate. That's nothing. Just some flirting. It doesn't mean anything. Don't bullshit me, Dahlia. My voice cracked under the weight of my anger. You've been sneaking around with him. I followed you. I saw you get out of his car and go into his apartment. Her smug facade crumbled for a moment, just long enough for me to see the guilt behind it. So what if I did? She snapped, folding her arms. It's not like you've been Mr. Perfect either. You've been distant and obsessed. You pushed me away. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You're blaming me? You're the one who cheated. She shrugged, her tone cold and unapologetic. I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt something snap inside me, a flood of rage I couldn't contain. Before I could stop myself, I started grabbing her things, clothes, shoes, whatever I could find, and throwing them toward the door. Get out, I growled. Get the fuck out of my house. She stared at me, stunned for a moment. Then her expression twisted into something bitter. It was a mistake, okay? I wasn't thinking clearly. But you never really understood me. Her words cut deeper than I wanted to admit, but I refused to let her see it. I stood there, breathing hard, fists clenched at my sides, as she grabbed her bag and stormed toward the door. She paused for a moment before stepping out, glancing back over her shoulder one last time. Good luck, Jasper. You'll need it. And then she was gone, just like that. I stood in the doorway, watching her disappear into the night, feeling both empty and relieved. I'd been waiting for that moment, fantasizing about it. But now that it had happened, all I felt was a hollow ache in my chest. Later that evening, Adam stopped by. I hadn't called him, but somehow, he knew I needed him. He walked in without saying much, just gave me a sympathetic nod and grabbed a couple of beers from the fridge. We sat on the couch in silence for a while, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Rough night, huh? He finally said, breaking the quiet. You have no idea, I muttered, taking a swig of my beer. We talked about Dahlia and the fight, about the messages and the surveillance. But I didn't mention Bree. I couldn't. That part of the story felt too heavy, too dangerous to share, even with Adam. The guilt gnawed at me, but I buried it deep, convincing myself that some things were better left unsaid. The days that followed were a blur of legal documents and bitter arguments. Dahlia wanted a divorce, and she wanted her share of everything we'd built together, despite the fact that she was the one who'd shattered it all. The process was messy and exhausting, draining what little energy I had left. Every interaction with her felt like reopening an old wound, and each passing day made it harder to remember why I'd ever loved her in the first place. One night, a few weeks into the divorce proceedings, I ran into Liam at a bar. I was nursing a drink, trying to forget about everything for a little while, when I saw him across the room. He spotted me too, and instead of looking guilty or ashamed, the bastard smirked and raised his glass in a silent toast. Something inside me snapped. I slammed my drink down on the bar and crossed the room in 3 quick strides, my fists clenched at my sides. Before I even knew what I was doing, I grabbed him by the collar and shoved him against the wall. You think this is funny? I snarled, my voice low and dangerous. You think you could just take everything from me and walk away? Liam didn't flinch. If anything, his smirk widened. Dahlia's with me now, he said, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. Guess you weren't enough for her. That was all it took. I swung before I could stop myself, my fist connecting with his jaw in a satisfying crack. He stumbled back, but before I could go after him again, the bartender and a couple of patrons grabbed me, pulling me away. Liam just laughed, wiping blood from his lip as he watched me struggle. "Take it easy, man," one of the guys holding me said. "He's not worth it." Maybe he was right. Maybe none of it was worth it. But in that moment, all I could see was red. All I wanted was to make him hurt the way I was hurting. Eventually, they let me go, and I stumbled out into the night, my knuckles throbbing and my heart pounding. The cold air hit me like a slap, and as I stood there on the sidewalk, I realized just how far I'd fallen. My marriage was over, my life was in pieces, and the only thing I had left was the bitter satisfaction of knowing I'd fought back, no matter how hollow it felt. The divorce wasn't just a legal process. It was the slow, painful unraveling of everything I thought I knew. And the worst part? Even as I tried to pick up the pieces, the memory of that night with Bree lingered, a dark stain I couldn't wash away. No matter how much I wanted to forget, it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, reminding me that I wasn't innocent in any of this. I had thought confronting Dahlia would bring closure. I thought it would set me free. But the truth was, the damage ran too deep, and there were some wounds that even revenge couldn't heal. After the divorce, I didn't know where else to go, so I ended up back at my father's house. Moving in with Ronald felt like admitting defeat, like the final nail in the coffin of everything I thought my life would be. The house was the same as ever, but nothing about it felt familiar anymore. And to make things worse, Bree was still there, acting like nothing between us had changed. The night we'd shared was a secret I carried like a weight strapped to my chest. It gnawed at me, but at the same time, I found myself drawn to her in ways I didn't fully understand. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop thinking about her. Every time we crossed paths in the kitchen or brushed shoulders in the hall, there was this silent, heavy tension between us. We didn't talk about what happened. We didn't have to. It was always there, hovering between us, a reminder of the mess we'd made. And somehow, despite everything, I kept getting pulled deeper into it. Bree had this way of making me feel seen, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not with Dahlia, not with anyone. But it was all tangled up with guilt and shame, a trap I couldn't seem to escape. A few months passed in this weird limbo, me pretending like everything was normal while the memory of that night haunted me. And then, one evening, Bree knocked on my door. She came in, looking nervous, more nervous than I'd ever seen her. I knew something was wrong before she even said a word. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm pregnant." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what she'd just said. Pregnant. She was pregnant. And the worst part? We both knew the baby could be mine. She sat down on the edge of the bed, wringing her hands. "We can't tell Ronald." "Not yet." I nodded, even though every instinct in me was screaming that this was a disaster waiting to happen. Keeping a secret like this felt like walking around with a live grenade in my pocket. It was only a matter of time before it blew up in our faces. At first, Ronald didn't notice anything. But as the weeks went by, he started picking up on the changes. Bree's strange behavior, her sudden mood swings, the way she avoided drinking at family dinners. He wasn't stupid. He knew something was off, and it didn't take long for his suspicions to land squarely on me. One night, during a family dinner, he dropped the bomb. "What's going on between you two?" he asked, his eyes fixed on me like a laser. "I know something happened." I froze. Bree looked down at her plate, saying nothing, and her silence was all the confirmation Ronald needed. He stood up slowly, his face dark with rage. "Don't lie to me," he growled. "Did you sleep with her?" I tried to deny it, but the words felt hollow, even to me. "Nothing happened," I muttered, though I knew he didn't believe me. Ronald's jaw clenched, and before I could react, he lunged. His fist connected with my face, sending me stumbling back into the wall. We went at it, grappling, shoving, fists flying in a blur of rage and betrayal. Years of resentment boiled to the surface, and we fought like men with too much history and too many wounds between them. "Tell me the truth," he shouted, pinning me against the wall. Bree finally spoke, her voice shaky but clear. The baby, it might not be yours, Ronald. Everything stopped. Ronald backed away from me, his face twisted in disbelief. For a moment, the room was silent, thick with the weight of what she'd just admitted. And then, without another word, Ronald turned and stormed out of the house. He left us both standing there, stunned and broken. The next few days were a blur of silence and tension. Ronald filed for divorce, packed up his things, and moved out without so much as a goodbye. He also had me served with a legal notice, demanding I leave the house within 30 days. I was homeless, jobless, and completely out of options. I ended up crashing on Adam's couch, too ashamed to ask anyone else for help. Adam did his best to be supportive, but there wasn't much he could do. I was spiraling, and he knew it. Losing Dahlia was one thing. Losing my father on top of it was something else entirely. It felt like the ground had opened up beneath me, and I was free-falling with no end in sight. The depression hit hard. I stopped answering texts, stopped going out, stopped caring about anything. I spent my days staring at the ceiling, drinking too much, and wondering how the hell my life had turned into this nightmare. There were nights when the darkness got so heavy I could barely breathe. I even thought about ending it, about slipping away quietly and leaving all the mess behind. But Adam wouldn't let me go that easily. One night, after pulling a nearly empty bottle of whiskey from my hand, he sat me down and said, "You can't keep doing this, man. You need to talk to your dad. At least try to make things right." At first, I refused. What was the point? Ronald hated me. But Adam kept pushing, and eventually I caved. I reached out, sent a text, and to my surprise, Ronald agreed to meet. We met at a small cafe, both of us awkward and tense. I could see the anger still simmering beneath his calm exterior. But there was something else too, something that looked a lot like regret. "I can't forgive you," he said, stirring his coffee without looking at me. "Not completely, but maybe we can start over. Try to rebuild something." It wasn't the reconciliation I'd hoped for, but it was more than I deserved. We sat there for a while, talking about everything and nothing, both of us knowing things would never be the same. But it was a start. In the weeks that followed, I slowly began to piece my life back together. It wasn't easy. The weight of the past clung to me, and there were days when I felt like I'd never escape it. But then, one day, I met someone. Her name was Selena, and she was nothing like Dahlia or Bree. She was kind, patient, and exactly what I didn't know I needed. We spent a lot of time together talking about life, our hopes, and the things we'd been through. With her, there were no games, no betrayals, just honesty. One evening, we sat on the beach, watching the sunset, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. The mistakes, the betrayals, the chaos, they were still there, but they didn't define me anymore. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Selena took my hand, and I realized that life, no matter how broken, goes on. There's always a way forward, even when it feels like everything has fallen apart. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new.